morning. Good morning. Great to be here. I don't have a PowerPoint this morning. I know. Johnny actually was wondering if it could be an official preach if there's not a PowerPoint, but we're gonna give it a go, which means that you will need access to a copy of the Bible. So if you have one on your phone, that's great, or if you have a physical copy, that's great, or any other device that you have that you can access God's Word, that's great. We're gonna look at the end of James chapter 4 and the beginning of James chapter 5, and James is towards the end of the New Testament. So if you just go to Revelation and then go back a little bit, you'll find the book of James. We started this series of James talking about discipleship, and James is actually a great book to be in for discipleship. Even as we look at our vision here, changing our area for God's glory by being disciples and making disciples of Jesus, it's really important to think about what is a disciple. And then from what is a disciple, how do I make disciples? The reason why this is important is not just for a pragmatic, practical, oh, this sounds like a good strategy, this sounds like a good way to go as a church, this sounds really cool, or this is kind of the hip in thing. It has nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with, that is actually what Jesus has asked us to do. In Matthew chapter 28, he asks us to go and make disciples. And so each of us, as followers of Jesus, those that have recognized our sin and repented and put our faith in Jesus, are disciples. And then one of the things that we're supposed to do as disciples is go and make other disciples. And so James is a really good book to talk about discipleship because it's very practical. And so as we think about discipleship, we've used kind of head, heart, hands. And as we think about discipleship, it's really important to think about the whole person, not just a part of the person. And so when we think about the head part, we're thinking about kind of understanding. And so it's really important that we do study and that we learn and that we understand the truths of the Bible, that we understand the truths of Jesus. And he's given us his word, and he's given us the community of believers to wrestle through an understanding in our head. But it's also really important for our heart. And our heart is our affections. It's also our motives. Like, what is the motive for obedience? What is my affections? And so that's the heart. And then the hands is the obedience. And so we need to be obedient as we are disciples. So it's not just about knowing something, but it's actually about doing what we know. And it's not just about feeling something, but it's about understanding what we're feeling and then applying that to our lives. And the challenge with the church where I come from in the United States of America, and a lot of churches that I've been in more in the Western world, is that we tend to highly focus on one of those, and that's the head. And so there's this sort of understanding that if I can just know more, then somehow that's going to translate into me being a better disciple. And so it's not that knowing stuff is wrong. Knowing stuff is a critical part of it. But if we only know and we don't do, then the Bible says we're hypocrites. And this is the same problem that we see the Pharisees and others in the New Testament get into, is that they talk a great game, but they don't really live it out. And so as we're talking about discipleship, then we are definitely talking about knowing, but we're also talking about God transforming our motives and the affections of our heart, while at the same time that's being applied in our life, my personal life, my family life, and to those that are around me. James is a book that primarily deals with the heart and the hands. It's not as much of an theological depth and understanding. It's much more of a practical application, and even as Johnny dug into last week, a motive, as he talked about where do divisions and fights among us come from? It comes from our passions. It comes from these motives that we have that lead to division. And so James is really tackling more of that practical part. And so it's not a book that gets talked about or taught a whole lot in the Western world, because it doesn't dive into the depths of theology, which we did in Romans right before James. There's a much more of a practical application. Another huge part of discipleship is impacting our worldview. Our worldview is how we, the lens by which we look at and engage the world. And the reality is, every one of us has a worldview. We served the Lord in India and South Asia for a long time, where we learned about a radically different worldview than my Western American worldview, and how people in India and South Asia look at and engage the world. They have a worldview which was developed on cultural expectations and family and life as they grew up. We in the West, we also have a worldview. And a part of discipleship is Jesus coming in through his word and through his spirit and challenging the parts of our worldview that need challenging, transforming how we view and look at the world and how we view and look at other people, and lining us up according to his ways and his truth, because his ways and his truth are the best ways, and they're the best for us. And so as we're going to look at these three different sections in this chapter, these end of James 4, beginning of James 5 today, it's going to challenge our worldview. I don't know about you guys, as we've gone through this book of James, there's been several times where I felt like it's kind of stepping on my toes a little bit. It's getting a little too real for me, a little too uncomfortable. And when that happens, it's easy for me to be like, well, Mark, he definitely needs to hear this. It's really easy for me to cast out instead of being like, you know what, I'm feeling conviction right now. I'm feeling like the Lord is challenging something in my heart. And I need to listen to that. I need to submit to that, because he ultimately wants to change me for his good. And as he changes me for his good, that actually then changes me for the good of everybody else around me. And so as we look at this, we're going to see three things that James challenges us on. And these are three, I'm going to say they're three idols, maybe idols that we don't see in our worldview, especially if you come from a country or a place of wealth and power and control. So the three idols that are going to be specifically addressed here by James are control, security, and comfort. And it's amazing to my own heart, and I'm the chief amongst here as I'm speaking, what I'm willing to do to keep control. It's amazing what I'm willing to do to keep my security. It's amazing what I'm willing to do to keep my comfort. I'll actually violate biblical truths. I'll even go against people if it means that I can keep my control and my security and my comfort. And that means it's an idol. But sometimes these are idols that we don't necessarily acknowledge and see, because they're such a deep, entrenched part of our worldview that it becomes really hard to see them. And James today is going to put them on a platter for us to look at and to engage with. So I want you to know you're probably going to feel some challenge, okay? And that's okay. The Lord challenges us in these areas, not to just slap us on the hand or not to just discipline us for fun's sake. He challenges us in these ways because he knows in the end, these are not healthy for us. And so he wants us to feel these things so that we can change to look more like him and actually to become disciples and better disciples of him, so that we can go out and make better disciples, okay? So I wanted to set that up in that way so that as we navigate this, you might feel some things in your heart and you'll kind of know where some of that is coming from. All right, so let's start with James 4:13 to 17, and this is the first section. So there's kind of three different sections or three different pieces here that James is dealing with, little short sayings of wisdom that he's talking about. I'm in the ESV, and whatever translation you have is great as well. James 4:13 to 17 says, "Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin." Now, I grew up in a family that was not wealthy in terms of American, even Western European wealth. We didn't have the best car or the best house, but we did have a good house, and we had a good car, and we had plenty of food to eat. And the reality is that we could make plans, and we could plan out a 5-year trajectory or a 3-year trajectory, and we could begin to execute those plans. And what can begin to happen is that you lose sight of who's actually in control of this thing. And so as we would make these plans and then begin to execute these plans, even as a follower of Jesus, pretty soon it became all about me. If I can make the right plans and if we can just have the right steps of execution to these plans, then I've got enough control that I can manipulate various things around me, and then we can come to the desired outcome based on my plans and me executing those plans. And when I went to India and lived there, I learned that there's a whole different set of people on the earth who they have no control over their plans. They have no control over their life. They live in poverty. They subject themselves to other people around them who have complete control of their life, and that was hard for me. That was a really hard challenge to my worldview. And this reminds me that Jesus is really in control. One of the perfect examples of this recently would be COVID. And how many of us had incredible plans made? We had steps to execute those plans. We had desired outcomes. And then COVID came. And before we knew it, we were in our homes, society shut down, and we were having to reevaluate everything that we were and everything that we were doing. And business leaders had to reevaluate, how do we do business in light of COVID? It was an uncontrollable thing that came into our life that we had to readjust around. And it was interesting to watch different cultures that I knew interact with the idea of some uncontrollable force coming in, and how do I engage with that? And it's really hard for us, I think, for me personally, to be out of control or to feel out of control. And the steps and the things that I'm willing to do to get back into control. But control, in the end, ultimately is an illusion. Control is in the Lord's hands. Now, that does not mean that it is wrong to make a plan. It's great to make a plan. My wife lives off of a list, and she makes plans, and she has lists. I do not live off of a list. I live off of a vision. And today it seems great to do this because we're heading this direction. Making a plan is perfectly fine, and it's perfectly legitimate, as long as it's submitted to the lordship and will of Christ. As long as it's submitted to the lordship and will of Christ. I remember several years ago, 2014 to 2016, my mom had cancer. And we were serving in India at the time. At first, it was stage 3 cancer, and she had got her first treatment had been done. Right after her first treatment had been done, my dad passed away suddenly. He had a gallbladder procedure, got infected, sepsis, boom, he was gone. So we came back for his funeral. My mom is still in treatment with her cancer. We're wrestling, what does this mean? And I'm trying to plan all this stuff out. I'm like, all right, Lord, if we do this and then we do that, and if I can do this and we can do this, then maybe this will happen. And in the end, the Lord is like, Jacob, just stop. Just trust me. Here's what I want you to do. And it was great to be able to, with comfort, jump into that and do what the Lord wanted us to do. It gave us a lot of confidence. My mom ended up passing away from cancer about 2 years later. And I remember going through this agony of praying for her healing and being like, Lord, please heal her, please heal her. And then in the end, she passed away. And this is a really, really hard thing for me in my faith and wrestling with. What does this mean? How do I process this? How do I deal with this? And the Lord brought me to a passage in Matthew, the Garden of Gethsemane. You guys remember that story? Where Jesus, the Son of God, the one who had no sin, he's perfect. He goes to the Garden of Gethsemane, takes a couple disciples with him, remember, who couldn't stay awake because he was praying. They kept falling asleep. And it shows Jesus praying 3 times in the Garden of Gethsemane. And it's fascinating to me what Jesus prays. He prays, Lord, take this cup from me. What's Jesus praying for? He's asking God to deliver him from the cross. God, if I don't have to go to the cross, please don't make me go to the cross. He's asking for deliverance. But then what's the next statement that Jesus makes? Yet not my will, but thine. And that passage gave me so much freedom that I could make plans and I could pray for my mom's healing, and we could even seek practical ways to see that happen, whether it's through treatment or medicine or whatever it is. But in the end, my heart posture had to be, Lord, not my will, but thine. And that gave me great courage and boldness to be able to pray with all faith, yet at the same time to submit what happens to the Lord, because his ways are so far above my ways. And this is what James here is talking about. Today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there, trade, make profit, yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For it is a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. So here's the amazing thing, is that we serve a God who today sits on his throne. We serve a God who created the earth and sustains the earth. We serve a God who created you. He knows everything about you. He knows every little detail. Psalm 139 says he knows every thought that you have thought. He knows every thought that you're thinking right now, and he knows every thought that you're going to think. He created you. He loves you. He knows you. He cares for you. And in the end, as we are looking to the future, we can submit ourselves to him, and he can be trusted. He can be trusted. Then we get into James chapter 5, which is the next one. It's kind of looked at control. Now we're going to look at security. And security here deals primarily with wealth. So in verse 1 of chapter 5, come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure in the last days. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you. So this is talking about an undue dependence on wealth. And I'm just going to admit to you guys and confess to you guys, I struggle with this one. I struggle with this one. And it's really hard for me to keep my heart in the right posture of depending on the Lord when I have the wealth that I need to do what I need to do. And it can be really hard, and it can be a tension for my own heart as I look at wealth and not to begin to trust and depend on this wealth. And if I'm not careful, this wealth or this money begins to give me things in my heart, value, begins to give me worth, begins to give me control. And I begin to take a lot of these things onto myself instead of remembering where they come from. And they come from the Lord. And so wealth in our society can become a very, very tricky, deceitful thing that we begin to depend on and over-depend on. And then something like 2008, the stock market crash happens. Or your business gets shut down. Artificial intelligence comes and takes over your job. Your health begins to fail, and you no longer have the income that you once had. Your kids start going to college, and all of a sudden, all your money goes to college. These things happen in life that we don't have control of. And if we have over-depended on wealth, then all of a sudden we find ourselves in desperate places and begin to do desperate things. And so you even see governments today who are used to a lot of wealth, who are struggling in wealth. And what are they doing? The wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you. Again, if we put our dependence in control, if we put our dependence in the security of wealth, the things that we are willing to do to keep those things are to even violate other people. And it's easy for me, like I said, to read this and be like, oh, I know somebody like that. I know a government who does that. It's harder for me to be like, you know what? I've even done that. I've been willing to cheapen something so that I could get the gain. I've been able to maybe, do a deal that was a little bit backhanded, but nobody was really hurt in the deal. Because in the end, I'm worshiping money, not God. This is a big one for my own heart. Now, it's interesting in the last one and in this one, there's a dynamic that begins to emerge that we're about to address in the third one, which is the temporary and the eternal. And so this theme emerges again in James 4 at the end, where he says that our lives are but a mist. We are temporary, but there is an eternal. Here when he's talking about money, your garments are moth-eaten, your gold and silver have corroded. Their corrosion will be evidence against you. There is a temporary nature even to finances. So why would we then put our hope in temporary things? Why are we so willing to latch on to temporary things so that they will feed us? When the reality is that we, as followers of Jesus, have something eternal. We have something concrete that we not only can depend on for today, but we can depend on forever. And this is the comfort and joy that we have as followers of Jesus, that as I've navigated other religions in the world, other religions don't have. To be able to concretely put our faith and dependence in one who lived, who died, and who rose again, and who one day will come back. There is an eternal nature to our life. And if we as believers get out of balance the temporary and the eternal, then we begin to struggle. Because we take out of context something that happened today in light of God's wisdom for eternity. And that becomes dangerous for us. It can become even harmful for us. And so that's where this last one comes in, patience and suffering. James 5, starting in 7, be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruits of the earth, being patient about it, until it receives the early and the late rains. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. As an example of suffering and patience, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. So the joy that we have is that we can be patient, because comfort can be had even in the midst of suffering and trials. Let's remember who James, the context of which James is writing this. So James, the half-brother of Jesus, he's the leader of the church in Jerusalem. And we know that the church in Jerusalem isn't like going through the best of times. We see Stephen, one of the 7 servants that are selected. He begins to boldly proclaim the gospel and gets brutally martyred at the end of Acts chapter 7. And then persecution, like heavy persecution, comes to the church in Jerusalem, where this guy named Saul, who will become Paul, is going house to house, taking believers and putting them in prison. So he's not writing this in the context of everything is great and joyous and we have abundance in everything. He's writing this in context of actually there's quite a bit of suffering and struggle. So that's the context in which James is writing here. And he says, be patient until the coming of the Lord. The farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not grumble against each other, so that you may not be judged. The judge is standing at the door, as an example of suffering and patience. And so there's this idea within suffering and within these hard things that happen of our life of patience. And this is where my idea of control and security and money and even comfort come into play. Because when things are happening to me that don't make me comfortable, patience is not the first thing that comes to my mind. Patience and waiting on the Lord are not the first things that come to my mind. Let's make a plan. Let's throw some resources at it, and let's solve this thing. Let's get out of the trouble that I'm feeling. And we're willing to do a whole lot to get out of the struggle and the suffering and the pain that we're feeling. And again, I am chief amongst them. But there's actually some things within suffering that are beneficial. To use kind of a little cheap analogy, last time I spoke, I talked about sin and my own health and going to the doctor and the doctor saying, hey, you're obese. And me first having to acknowledge, you know what, I am obese. And the first step is just acknowledging it. Because I could be like, how dare you talk about my, this is so improper. But just acknowledging it. Now I will say people have taken that out of context. I'm not like morbidly anything. Just, you guys get the point. Now, acknowledging that I'm obese is one thing, but how do I then get healthy? Well, I have to go on a diet and I have to start working out. I don't know if you guys have worked out, but whenever I work out and I'm done working out, I'm not like, this feels amazing. I'm like, I don't know if I can walk down these stairs because there's a little bit of pain involved. I've been attempting these last couple months to go on a diet. And I'll tell you, I start the morning off amazing. And most days I can make it through lunch. And then comes the evening. And you open the cupboard and you're like, green things, vegetable things, healthy things, chocolate things. And somehow you always end up going for the chocolate things because it's hard. And then you have these hunger pains. But it's through the pain that you get the gain. Unfortunately, I've tried, I've looked. If you come up with one, then you can become a billionaire and find your security and wealth. There's no way to get healthy apart from some struggle, apart from discipline, apart from some pain. There's no way to do it. And so, looking then at some of the suffering, at some of the pain that we're going through, as the ability to grow in our dependence and our faith in the Lord. It's reminding me as I go through these things, you know what? I'm not the one in control. I'm not the one that has the power and authority to solve this. I'm not the one that has the plan to do this. It's actually not on me. It's on someone much greater. And it takes for me, because I'm stubborn, to go through some of these times for God to remind me, Jacob, you can take your hands off the wheel. Jacob, I know right now you're looking at your bank account and it doesn't look very good, but I'm on my throne and I love you. Jacob, I know you're looking at this situation and through your human eyes it looks terrible. And I know even it feels terrible. But I'm doing something through that. And so sometimes there's actually comfort through the the suffering. He uses Job as an example here. Job is a really hard book for me. It talks about suffering. And, Job's where Satan comes to God, and Satan says, I bet I can get Job from you. I can steal Job from you because the only reason he loves you is because of what you've given him. The only reason he loves you is because of the blessings you've given him. If he didn't have those blessings, if you took those away, he'd run away from you faster than anything. So what happens? God allows the enemy to take all those things from Job. And he doesn't actually ever really answer the question of why suffering happens. But Job in the end does learn that God is God. His wisdom is far above our wisdom. And Job learns a whole lot of lessons that would be good for us even to learn as we walk through Job. He uses Job here as an example. So how do we then, in the midst of some of these challenges, continue to have faith? Continue to seek the Lord and to pray big things? We are more than free to pray, and Lord, my bank account looks a little low. Please, would you help? God, whether it's a new job, whatever it would be. My health, the doctor just gave me a bad report. Jesus, would you please heal me? The struggle that my kids are having. Pray. And next week we'll see how prayer is a huge part of this whole thing. Yet at the same time, on the other hand, we have to say, Lord, not my will, but thine. Because otherwise we assume a position that was not ours to assume. So as we close up here, I just want to remind us of what we have to look forward to in eternity. Colossians 3:2 says, set your minds on things that are above, not on things that are on earth. Because we have something greater that we're looking forward to, even in the midst of your trial today. Revelation 21:4 gives us a great picture of what we have to look forward to. One day, he will wipe away every tear from your eyes. Death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain, for the former things have passed away. My mom had put her faith in Jesus. I had the privilege of sharing at her celebration service. I had never really dug too deep into death and the Bible. But as I did, I learned that the word death is actually never used for a believer in Jesus. Did you know that? Sleep is used. Because as a follower of Jesus, death has been defeated. That's why Jesus rose out of the grave. So as believers, we go to sleep and we wake up. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death is no more. All the resources, everything that we need to satisfy us are there. And that is where our faith and our hope rest. So even as we make our plans, even as we have our bank accounts, even as we go through trials in life, whether we're found to have abundance or to be in need, we have the privilege of submitting ourselves to the one who sits on the throne, who is my satisfaction, whether my bank account is the best in the world or the worst in the world, whether my health is the best in the world or the worst in the world. He's the one that satisfies. He's the one that satisfies. So as I think about needing control, or I think about looking to worldly things for security, or I'm seeking comfort, just remember, don't ultimately seek those things and things that are temporary, because they will fail you. Period. They will fail you. But there's one thing that won't, and that is Jesus. So came to this earth. He lived a perfect life. Even while we were still sinners, knowing who we are and knowing all of these things about us, he still chose to die on a cross. He shed his blood so that we could be forgiven. And then 3 days later, he rose again, defeating death and giving us eternal life. So what we experience on this earth, we have his help through, and then we look forward to a day of eternity in his presence and in his glory. Jesus, thank you so much for your goodness and your grace. Father, even as we evaluate our own hearts this morning and we look at maybe taking control out of your hands and putting it in our hands as we make our plans, or maybe as we think about money and the false security that it can tend to bring, maybe as we think about struggles and trials of life. Jesus, thank you for the truth of your word, and I pray that it would help us even this morning to put those things in the right context. God, the temporal compared to the eternal, the trust and dependence and faith that we can have in you, who loves us, who is sitting on his throne, who's the creator and sustainer of the earth. God, thank you that we can, in this temporal life, God, we can walk through it in confidence and in faith because we serve you. We love you and praise you this morning in Jesus' name. Amen.